So just to give you a bit of flavour in terms of what we want to cover today in terms of the agenda as part of this first session, do a bit of introduction, a bit of context setting. Then we'll give you a little bit of a kind of supply chain overview, a bit of a crude kind of oversight of what supply chain is all about, some of the problems or the opportunities in the context of London, Westminster, a little bit about the ZEG journey for those people who new to ZEG, and then touching on the roles of different actors within the area. And then I'm going to pass over to David to give a bit of a talk about the history and the context in the area in a little bit more detail as well, and then finish with a little bit of a summary. So we'll share these slides after the session as well for everybody in attendance and those who couldn't come as well. So kick start. We're looking to deliver 4 knowledge share sessions. So this is the first one, just providing this kind of general oversight as I mentioned previously. And we also want to invite speakers for each of these sessions as well. So David, in this case, has kindly offered his time to do that. And we'll do that with other organisations going forward for the other 3 sessions. So the session aims for today really, so give a bit of a summary around freight servicing delivery in the context of London and ZEG and the journey to date. Appreciate some of the current trends that are taking place across London as well, and then to really highlight the role that different actors can play in influence and meeting some of those strategic objectives around FSD. So a little bit of context around why we're looking at FSD, freight delivery and servicing, and what do we mean by that. So ultimately, at a very high level, it's very much around how you support safe, healthy and prosperous places. And in terms of freight and logistics and supply chains, the role they play in supporting people's quality of life and standard of living. So that's the kind of very high level why do we think it's important and what do we mean? But how does this translate on a practical basis? So this is really about how to enable ways to deliver goods to people and organisations, as well as conducting services, importantly as well, we can't forget about that, in the safest, most sustainable and efficient way, at the right time, in the right vehicle, in the right place. So again, why are we focusing on this specifically in Westminster? So this is really to understand and manage and balance FSD needs and challenges. So some of the externalities that it can bring, whilst also supporting and enabling consumer needs and expectations in what is a growing city with competing needs. And who plays a role in influencing this change? We'll come on to this later on as well. But everybody, so collaboration is really obviously key, really important to addressing some of the challenges, and we'll talk about some of those in a second as well, but also supporting some of the opportunities too. So we'll give you a bit of a very crude overview of supply chains. I'm sure this is probably familiar to many of you as well. But just as an overview, sometimes we tend to think about supply chains for freight as parcel carriers and parcels from Amazon, UPS, etc. And that's obviously generated through your online ordering and your e-commerce. So as an example, that is obviously a key player within the freight mix. So they're coming from delivery offices or regional distribution centres, either spotted around industrial sites in London or on the edge of the M25. And obviously, parcels are getting delivered to businesses. They are getting delivered to residents. And we find that generally those types of operators, I mentioned some of those before, they're doing about 60 to 100 drops per shift, depending on the density of the area they're serving and also the operator servicing level. So they are a key player, of course, but we want to think a little bit more broadly about FSD to consider the retailers, the 3PLs, the third-party logistics operators, perhaps coming in articulated lorries. So they may be doing stock refills at some shops, which could be a supermarket through to a retail store. So again, they'll have what we can refer to as regional distribution centres on the edge of the M25 in most cases, or indeed further afield. And they'll be delivering in, again, to retail stores. There could be other organisations and sectors as well, but just as this example. And if they're HGVs, they're going to be fully laden, usually with roll cages or indeed pallets. And they'll be going into stores. And there's often a reverse flow as well to maximise what you call the payload capacity of those vehicles with packaging. And they may do multiple jobs. So there may be multiple jobs that they do over the course of their shift. So that gives a bit of feel around retailers, perhaps, and articulate lorries. We've also got waste providers, and waste is something there's a real key focus in within Westminster and as part of the ZEG objectives as well. So this is recycling streams. It's also refuse as well. And again, they'll have local depots scattered across the city as well. So all of your larger vehicles operating and servicing businesses through the contracts that they have. And they'll be optimising their routes as best as possible for collections within certain time windows and what the operational environment affords. So the customer density will vary as well from place to place too. Again, just continuing, there are other areas to consider, and service and trades are often the one that goes under the radar as well. And I'll come on to some statistics in a moment about those. So service and trade, everything from your plumber, electrician, through to your utilities companies. So again, from a perspective of what they do, it's around property maintenance as well as highways maintenance as well as other different sectors that they serve. So they could be coming as vans from the employee home. It could come from a local depot, and there's a relationship between those two as well. And they could be serving businesses and residents. The service of trades could be responding to call-outs, or indeed it could be scheduled property maintenance or highway maintenance for that matter as well. So there's a number of different trips and trip training that they could be making over the course of the shift, which may be planned, but may be quite ad hoc as well. So that's something to bear in mind when we come to looking at some of the problems or challenges. And then cycle logistics. So these may be organisations that have e-cargo bikes as part of their own fleets. So maybe a small bakery or a small organisation with a freight need. It could also be third-party providers as well. So they could be delivering bespoke products, everything from flowers through to bakery items, as I mentioned before. Usually have quite a local catchment area, high density, but a lower number of drops, certainly compared to vans because of their payload. So it could be a local business, and it could be going to other businesses, so B2C, B2B flow, or it could be going to residents as a B2C. So as I say, it could be contracted or it could be a business, and that's generally a local catchment area in which they serve. And then lastly, I mean, this is not exclusively, there's obviously other elements that we consider around construction, for example, but in terms of other areas for consideration, things like sector specialists. So food servicing, for example, is often quite a common one, particularly in Westminster, to serve the food retail outlets and restaurants. So again, there'll be local depots or indeed things like dark kitchens as well in some cases. And they'll be delivering to businesses a whole wide range of products which may need chilled or refrigerated conditions for delivery, which obviously influences when and how they get delivered and the types of vehicle as well. So that's a bit of a crude overview of supply chains. I just wanted to bring this down to kind of the street level and then get a few people's thoughts in terms of kind of some of the challenges perhaps that we have within the context of Westminster. So imagine our street. How can we work together as organisations, perhaps within the same markets or same industries or same sectors? How do we actually minimise trips and influence suppliers as well? And we'll come on to some of the objectives of ZEG for aiming to do that. And then how do we also minimise some of the pressures on the curbside, especially when we've got these competing objectives? So new cycle lanes going in, new parking infrastructure as well. So how does freight delivery and servicing fit within that? So just in terms of the kind of street performance that you may see in the context of Westminster as well. I mentioned stock refill from previously, so they may be coming in early morning, outside of peak periods of the morning, doing a stock refill, so it may be a HGV delivering that. You may get that fresh food delivery I mentioned before. Fresh food obviously needs to be fresh, so it needs to come in and be prepared to support restaurants and cafes, so maybe come in early doors as well. Then you may start getting your services and trades come in just before the 9 o'clock mark, who are going to be staying usually for a slightly prolonged period of time on the curbside to access property, obviously depending on the job at hand as well. Then you'll suddenly get your first wave, is what we tend to find, which are your parcel carriers who are coming out sort of between 9 and 10 o'clock. So some familiar names coming out and starting to do their first round of drops in the morning. You may get your sector specialists. I mentioned food servicing, but it includes others as well who are coming in and again maybe within a vicinity or at the curbside for a slightly prolonged period of loading and unloading, depending on the commodities being moved. Then you may get your waste provider coming in. So you can see it's starting to get a bit busy on the street. And obviously they'll be responding to the particular time window in which they're collecting on a street or area basis. Make it a cycle logistics operation going out, whether it's a business doing their own drops or a third party provider doing that. And then you may get another services or trade, and again, another fast food takeaway, certainly around the 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock mark when it's lunchtime period as well. So obviously that brings in a different dimension to the street that's accelerated in recent years, especially since the pandemic as well. And then you'll get your second round of your parcel operators doing drops within an area as well in response to people's online retail behaviours. Construction I mentioned before, that's a little bit more ad hoc depending on developments and depending on the context, but we want to put those in the mix as well. Usually, obviously, slightly larger vehicles. Once start getting into your tippers and your articular lorries. And then again, you may get another cycle logistics operation in the afternoon, followed by, again, another stock refill outside the shoulders of the day and towards the evening. And then you suddenly get this increase in fast food takeaway operations again on a collection of different types of modes, which brings its own challenges. So we just wanted to kind of demonstrate the street performance almost takes place. But does anybody have any particular kind of views or thoughts around some of those three questions at the top there in response perhaps to this street performance that's taking place? Any hands up? David, you pop in a few comments in there. Hugh.
Thank you. You're Sandy, aren't you? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, thank you for this. In respect to your questions, I think how to minimise pressures on the curbside. I think if there's a street where there's a number of businesses who know each other, either because they've got the common leasehold or they have a common group of discussing, it'd be great if companies could work together and shops could work together to look at timeframes where certain hours could be avoided and certain hours could not be. So I think in answer to your question, it's not just how the council manages the curbside, but also how businesses would like to manage their communities. So that's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Any other thoughts? David?
On the question about minimising trips to influence suppliers links with how do organisations work together is organisations, even if they're not related, have similar supply chain needs. For example, office supplies is an obvious one. If you have 10 different office suppliers coming to a street, that's 10 deliveries a week or even a day if they operate as everybody wants their pencils next day. But if you start to collaborate, you can reduce the number of suppliers coming to the street significantly and still get the same sort of service levels that you would otherwise get. And office supplies are often not a thing that which supplier you use perhaps doesn't alter the quality of what you receive very much. What you want is one that's reliable and you're not going to add lots of congestion. So collaborating not just on between organizations that are in similar businesses, but organizations that have similar types of supply chain, incoming supply chain.
I think there's a hand up. Is it Victoria?
Yeah, hi. That's probably following on a little bit from what David's just said. I think in terms of how organisations can work together, I'm coming at it obviously from a landlord perspective. I think there are common services. Now that comes with its challenges because obviously different organisations have different frameworks and supplier agreements, but I think there is common ground that can be found here in terms of agreements on some of the core services to reduce traffic which is coming in terms of servicing. And I think the area that I'd be particularly, and I think I've spoken to Rosa about this separately, an area that I'd be particularly interested in looking at is around the parcels, you know, that influx of parcels that we're all getting, because I think that's a headache in many shapes and forms for us all, and looking at how we can come to some form of consolidation. I think we'd certainly be interested in looking at trialling that and looking at options as to distribution centres outside of the city to streamline how that's actually then coming into Westminster. I think that's definitely worth consideration.
Cool. And just so I've got a question actually, just in response to those questions as well. What's the best forum for on a kind of very practical level, when bringing businesses together who've got similar types of supply chains or around that collaboration? What's the best forum? Have there been different forums that have been tried? What's the best way to do that? Is there any views on that? David?
I think bids have an important role because they cover an area, and a lot of this work is done in an area. Bids in conjunction with landlords that are significant in those areas are very effective, because a landlord can only effectively have collaboration between businesses for whom he is the landlord. But there are other businesses in the same area that would benefit who are members of a bid. You can get the critical mass you need to persuade suppliers this is worth looking at, this is worth investing the effort in. That'd be one. And I just want to respond to Victoria's point about parcels. I think parcels is a difficult one because I can see at an individual office level you appear to have lots of vehicles coming in, but all those vehicles in the West End anyway, those vehicles may deliver to lots, and you have 2 DP in my area, Covent Garden. You'll have 2 Amazon vans, 2 DPD vans, 2 UPS vans. They come into the area, they drop their loads, they go away again. They've delivered to everyone. And if you make them all deliver to a distribution centre instead somewhere, you'll have the same number of vans coming in to drop at each of the locations. You won't reduce the number of vans that come into the area. You might reduce the time they stay. You won't reduce the number of vans. So it doesn't really make a lot of difference. So I think that it can be helpful, particularly if you can combine it with other flows. But there are some unintended consequences of deciding you're going to consolidate something that's got such a small delivery footprint for each vehicle. I'm not saying it can't be made to work, but it's not as simple as we've got lots of deliveries coming in, so from different people, let's consolidate them for that particular supply chain.
Is that Rose's hand up? I can't quite see.
Yeah, that's mine. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, I guess going back to your initial question, I think it's a difficult one because there's other kind of mechanisms that as a landlord you can use. And I think someone mentioned before around the role of bids, and I do think they are very important because they reach a lot of businesses that may not be our direct tenants. And also I think we've used things like green leases, and I'm sure some of the other landlords on this call may have done something similar as well, but you're quite restricted. Or sometimes when you are going through that negotiation period with prospective tenants, there is almost that kind of reluctance sometimes from businesses to sign up to your kind of, green leases that you have that might, I guess, require your tenants to consolidate their deliveries or do something around their waste. So I do think that's kind of a hard approach you can take, but I think you also need to combine that with a bit of a soft approach. So, what can you do to create kind of forums, or is it like a marketing campaign that you can educate your tenants and really take them on that journey rather than saying, oh, we want you to do this, but they don't exactly have the means or the knowledge to be able to do that. And I think that's a lot harder to do. Like, it's a lot easier to have a green lease and ask them to sign up to it, but it's a lot more difficult to try, really kind of engage them and take them on the journey and kind of bring them up to speed. Like, that requires a lot of resources that a lot of, I guess, businesses may not have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, trying to kind of convey the benefits of investing some time and thinking about this as well. Something that
and I think David mentioned before about what are the kind of common suppliers or common kind of items that some of the businesses use, and could you do something there to I guess consolidate your supplies. I think that has been looked at a number of times through different pilots, and it's always it's never really survived the pilot stage, like the post-pilot stage. So I do wonder what is it is quite difficult to do as well.
That'd be interesting to understand a little bit more about that. Why that hasn't kind of been pursued long term, hasn't been a legacy. Is that Victoria again?
Yeah, sorry, Kendra. I was literally about to say the same thing to Rosa, to say, well, when we've done the trials in the past, what's been the feedback as to why it's fallen away? And I can probably guess at the reasons, because people have their own preferred supply chains, their own agreements and costings, and there's a competition edge in there as well. But I would still say that there are certain services that probably aren't as sensitive to that, definitely from a commercial landlord perspective. From an occupier and business perspective, that might be different, particularly when you're looking at F&B. I think it probably is slightly trickier. But I think if you looked across office developers and you looked at waste streams, there's very little difference in reality between who we're using, and a lot of us are already using the same suppliers anyway. So I think we could probably try and get under the skin of that a little bit more closely. But it'd be interesting to see the results from the pilots to actually see what it was that made them not continue.
Yeah.
And regarding Sam, your question about Sandy about forums, I mean, a simple idea could be just to set up a WhatsApp group across interested people in landowners, bids, and other stakeholders in the area, so they can just exchange ideas and say, hey, I'm getting some more deliveries coming out. I'm thinking about changing my supply to DPD. And if you do have common areas of joining together, that could mean you got bargaining power with those companies, and also leverage to say, can you come at this time on this day instead of another time that suits them. So it's that kind of just common sharing of people's experiences and needs, and there may be some matches going on there.
Yeah, that's a quite interesting point, actually. That kind of fostering a little bit of a culture around it, and that kind of informal contact between people. We found that in a particular street in the city where that was the case, and it worked well for them, albeit it was difficult to track and monitor, but anecdotally in a way, by engaging through what was like a street forum, it worked. They'd fostered that culture and around kind of right doing servicing. So yeah, that's a really interesting point on WhatsApp group. Okay, I'll move on just to cover a few more slides before we bring David in as well. So what we've done as well, we've just drawn out some interesting stats that have come from a few reports recently, and which are kind of really interesting and provoke some thought around actually what the nature of the challenges are as well in the context of London. So this first one here around LGVs, most commercial vehicles being LGVs, and then make up 15% of all vehicles counted. So all the sources for this, by the way, are referenced in the slides, so you can be able to see this as well. So 5 times more than HGVs. So it gives you a little bit of a context, and obviously that's seen an increased kind of trajectory over the last 4 to 5 years. But interestingly, most of those LGVs were service vans rather than making deliveries. So that's really interesting point around who actually that we're looking at kind of targeting when it comes to minimising freight activity and emissions to the vehicles as well. So that was quite an interesting point that came from one of those reports. Equally, the fact that, and it's probably surprising, that e-car bike use has risen as well between 2022 and 2023, and the opportunity, depending on the commodity as well, of course, and depending on the nature of the supply chain trips as well, but the potential there to convert some of those van kilometres that are being replaced as well. Equally, just going back a few years to the van survey that was done as well. Again, it was interesting the split when it came to thinking about vans, that it was 60% of these were held by businesses, but then 38% were held privately by your sole traders and trades. And then 75% of those LGV vehicle miles in London were made by businesses as well. So it gives you a bit of a feel around, again, the who to work with around challenging some of those. And again, this is London context and not necessarily Westminster, but again, provides interesting reading. And then this point here around, again, this is taken a little while ago in terms of 2019, 2020 around van statistics, about how many percentage of van sales were actually zero emission. So still relatively low, still a way to go, basically, is the main message. So how can that be accelerated? And then interestingly, again, thinking about those service trips particularly, actually, what are they actually doing? So carrying equipment and tools was the big driver behind the use of those vans. and LGVs. So actually thinking about how you potentially mode shift the fact that these vans serve up more than just a mode of transport. They are mobile hubs for storage, and obviously the behaviour change element with them kind of cajoling people away from using them and moving towards sustainable forms of transport as well. And interesting that point there, around 21% of vans are used for deliveries. So that gives you a bit of a comparison, some of the big players we've mentioned already there. And then lastly, this is just a point around general commodity flows in the context of London as well. So unsurprising to see food and drink waste and construction materials, but groupage, which are obviously a combination of pallets, containerised goods as well, being the biggest commodity group. So again, a bit of context setting there around what's going in and out of the city as well. Now, there was a lot more stats that we've kind of hid on slides as well. But again, just to provide a bit of a flavour around maybe what some of the challenges are. So coming on to this slide here, we'll get a few more people's thoughts. What are some of the kind of the issues that generate all the kind of cause and effects? So starting off with, and again, as we've mentioned before, buying goods online, particularly for same or next day, obviously generates a lot of drops, a lot of drop activity, and that puts the pressure on the road network and the curbside. So that's obviously influenced by our decisions as consumers to a large extent as well. And then selecting a waste provider, I think you mentioned this, Victoria, around the different waste providers that operate as well, and the opportunity, although at the moment it's around an issue around collaboration with others, because that means there's multiple operators serving the same area. And if there's a low density of customers as well, based on recent discussions with some of those waste providers, it reduces the viability of e-cargo operations, which a number of those are piloting, if not embedded within their fleets. And then one of the points that's been raised, I think this is one of the big objectives to look at as well, is again around waste and recycling, but the kind of public realm, the visual amenity point there about being on the streets for prolonged periods and the impact potentially that has on perceptions of place and potentially footfall. Although obviously that's just that at this stage, but it's an interesting one that's popped up a few times as well. And then just in terms of issues, again back to that point around servicing, around are there scheduled trips that are taking place that are checkups when there's no actual problem, and the impact that has in terms of again access, road congestion, and the curbside. So that again, that's not an exhaustive list by any means, but we've touched on, I think there's a few points that people raised about addressing those issues. And I would just say actually, just before opening the room, I think the point around some of the parcel carriers as well. Interesting, obviously doing a lot of innovation pilots within the context of Westminster as well to reduce their drop activity. So I think it was Amazon recently was doing the foot porterage. So they're parking in one location and using the van as a hub to then distribute over the last 100, 250 meters on foot to deliver. So that's kind of reducing the number of stop starts, you could say, and it's, I suppose, it's a potential kind of to enable operators to do things more sustainably and put a bit more of an onus on them to do so. Any thoughts on how any additional thoughts on addressing some of these points here, maybe around the servicing point with that statistics, or those few statistics in the previous slide? David dropped them. David dropped a comment in the chat.
Yeah, what on the waste and refuse piece, leaving it out on the street for collection is a bugbear in the West End because it gets in the way, it makes a mess. I know that in some, and maybe some people on this call are doing it, but in Grosvenor and others have worked with some of the waste providers to get them to come around and essentially do reverse consolidation, so collect from outside the premises more frequently, bring it to a single location, do that bit with cargo bikes, and then an a refuse vehicle will come in still, but only have to go to one place, not to have to drive up and down all the streets. And if you could make that more broad scale, you could really make an impact on what gets sat on the street. There are other ways of doing it as well, but that's something you need to think about when you do new developments, which we might come on to at a future session.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good point, David. And I think that was the message from some of the operators we spoke to a couple of weeks ago. I spoke to 3 or 4.
I think just another thing on that is the scheduled servicing streets for checkups, trips for checkups. But just be careful, because if you don't do preventative maintenance, you end up having to bring a vehicle in to change a whole machine later, rather than just more frequently checking it and changing washers and bearings and things like this. And then you don't check it enough times, it blows up. That's a big issue, is that people don't do sufficient maintenance in the West End.
Yeah, absolutely. The point, and I think it came up maybe a couple of years ago, was around virtual servicing. I don't know whether that's something that's taken off at all, or whether that's an option to kind of to continue with property management maintenance. Rosa?
Yeah, it was just on that servicing point. We looked at this as a group, ZEG, a couple of years ago, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I know there was a separate working group on this one. And wasn't there something identified? I don't know if you remember, Sandy, but it was around the fact that I think they were looking at buildings. I think it was actually with Derwent at the time, and we found that there was actually a lot of kind of trips made that weren't really required, and that was due to some kind of I'm not quite sure what it was, but essentially they were saying that these could be reduced and they weren't actually required.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I recall the that being the case, and I'm trying to recall the platform that was being discussed at the time. So it was called Omni Systems, which was kind of a way in which to kind of virtually service properties or elements of a property, whether it was your boiler or any other feature, which, the idea being to reduce some of those trips for checkups. But I'm not sure whether that got any further, or whether anyone else has looked at that since, if it was the next working group.
Yeah, maybe we just dig that back up again and see what. Because I think the stats that you showed before were actually really surprising. I didn't realise that it was so high for servicing.
Yeah, there's really good reports that kind of David signposted, and there's some really interesting stuff in there. So and that was definitely surprising. I think we've got another hand, so I couldn't see who that was.
Hi, it's James. Yeah, I mean, I think beyond, there's obviously some very great technical solutions potentially out there, but there are some really simple things that when somebody's calling up for a service or for something that's wrong, to be clear about what it is. And I think quite often, I work for the council, and you see this happen all the time. People ring up and then not be clear about what it is, and it will take twice as long to get the job done because they haven't given the right instructions in the first place. Not at Westminster, but other authorities. I remember going out on a job myself years ago, and it was a bit of a bizarre one. So I was dealing with a noise complaint. We were executing a warrant to enter a property. The guy turns up to disable the alarm, and he was going to get into the house. He then didn't have the tools to get into the house. Then he called an alarm technician who turned up and said, "I'll disable the alarm." Couldn't disable the alarm because he didn't have a ladder. So we had 3 vans out for the same job. And really, it was just about who holds the ring on it, who's got the clarity to provide the instruction about what's required. And then you'll get a single vehicle turning up with the right tools to do the job and complete the work. So we can, generate some complexity around it, or we can simplify by making sure that the instruction's nice and clear. I think the sort of waste and refuse piece is complicated, and both in terms of that sort of visual amenity impact for people and the impact on sort of, the economy in the area. But I think going back to David's point about sort of waste consolidation, in space constrained places, that is difficult, but it's absolutely the right thing to do. It's the necessary thing to do. And not only is that consolidation of waste in terms of kind of putting it all in one place, but it's also trying to see if there are any ways of treating that waste. So energy for waste on site, can that be done? Those sorts of things. So those small scale things can be done and are done. So they're things to consider. But part of that means that the landowners need to be working collectively with the council and others to identify those opportunities for space, and collectively work to bring that forward, because that's the difficulty, isn't it? It's identifying the space, maintaining that space, and so on, so that an operator can come in and help.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, James. No, a really good point. So around, like, it's almost like a sliding scale when it comes to thinking about the really simple things to start with before thinking about the more complex or time-consuming or costly elements further down the line. Well, on that point around opportunities, that exact point is something that that we want to raise, and actually some of the conversations with industry have expressed interest in space to allow them to do things differently, and that includes some of the waste providers. So we've got some slides from the likes of First Mile, which kind of stipulates their kind of requirements or what they're looking for. So there's opportunity there from a revenue perspective as a landowner if you're on the utilised space, but also to enable and support industry to do things more sustainably as well. We touched on collaboration and facilitation around suppliers, purchasing behaviours, and that kind of informal element as well that you mentioned here around the bargaining power that you have, the potential that offers as well with the right forum. And then obviously touching on procurement as well as a process and a lever for change as well, to incentivise and support and nudge operators. And then obviously that point around e-cargo bites lastly as well, and the opportunity that presents. I think David will talk a little bit around the EV element in relation to this, the broader operational environment, how that's changing in London as well. So conscious of time, so I want to move on to David's section.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, David, you've got something to say as well.
No, that's fine.
So yeah, just very quickly before we move on to David as well, the ZEG journey, which most of you again will be familiar with. So it all started from the Freight Servicing Delivery Action Plan in 2020, in which one of those measures, 87 measures, was about forming what's now become the Zero Emission Group, bringing together landowners and the business improvement districts. So that membership and the group started formally in 2021. And then over the course of the 3-year programme from 2022 to now, there's been year one, which is around the kind of database aligning, really understanding what the state of freight is in relation to Westminster, starting to develop some of the toolkit content, and then obviously the launch of the charter and supporting that, which came around 2023. Obviously led and supported by a number of organisations with lots of benefits to members. And then 2024, we've had year two in terms of, again, the role that WSP has played in that, looking at a pipeline of potential pilots, which also included completing one around building collaboration, which I think we'll touch on the next session as well. We'll talk a bit about that. And then complete toolkit content and mobilising a strategic DSP pilot as well, or planning for that. And then there was a bit of a ZEG strategy, which has led into year three, which is where we're very much focusing on the delivery of pilots and responding to some of those themes, as well as these sessions around freight knowledge share. And again, I won't touch on this too much. I think David will touch on this, but there's been a vision and an approach that's been set around ZEG, and some of the measures around remoding, reducing and optimising activity in Westminster, with the outputs being a roadmap, toolkit content, and, as I mentioned before, the pilots in this year. So just to pass over to David, just very briefly, as I mentioned before, everyone plays a role when it comes to supporting FSD changes within Westminster. So you've got your landowners and bids, let's call them being the enablers, rooted within the locality with certain levers that you can pull. You've got obviously the business community, who are obviously driving some of the demand for freight delivery and servicing, and can influence obviously what they purchase and when they do that, and have that relationship with the logistics industry, with the movers. Obviously they're responding to people's demands and contracted to do so as well, using multiple modes of transport. And there's a relationship obviously between all those different organisations, and I'll just leave that for now so we can move over to David to talk about specifically some of the points around the relationship between FSD historically and going forward. I should mention obviously the local authority, the public authorities, and different layers of government and governance involved in shaping the operational environment as well. So that's enough from me. I was going to pass over to you, David, and I can
okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to start by just introducing myself. So my name is David Kainer. I'm been a member of ZEG since it started, but wearing different hats. If you could click the button, Sandy. So I've got a number of different hats that fit into all the boxes. So I've been a member of ZEG. Previously, I was a member of the West End Partnership Board, which included bids, landowners, Westminster, Camden, the GLA, and I was there as a member of residents groups. I don't know, several of your organisations had people who were on the West End Partnership, and ZEG evolved from work that the West End Partnership was doing in this area, which I'll come on to. I've also run physical supply chains, so I've been a generator of freight and a buyer of freight services as a member of the business community, and I'm now also the manager of an organisation called the Central London Freight Quality Partnership, which brings together boroughs, TfL and freight businesses and their representatives to think about how you make what are the issues in the West End for freight. So I've sort of got hats in all these different areas. Sandy, if you could move on. I just want to go a bit further backwards on the journey. So you've got there the slide that Sandy showed around the ZEG journey, but the work has been going on in this area has been going on for quite a long time. In fact, if you go back as far as the preparation for the Olympics, a gentleman called Ian Wainwright at TfL did a lot of work on how do you do freight and servicing in the city to cope with the Olympics. More recently, you had reports from the Mayor's Transport Strategy, the Mayor's FSD Action Plan, the National Infrastructure Commission produced a report on freight, and the West End Partnership actually produced a freight and servicing action plan for the West End back in 2018. And the work of ZEG, I would say, has been based on those bits of work that have come before. And fortunately, other boroughs, as they picked up Westminster's focus on FSD and the City of London's focus on FSD, Camden's recently produced its strategy for freight and servicing, its freight and servicing action plan. It's got a lot of commonalities with things that have come before. So fortunately, we're all working in the same direction, but it is very complicated. If you could move on. So this is a saying from Deming, or somebody else. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So the reason that freight is a mess is essentially it's been designed that way, not necessarily deliberately, but it's very complex and there are lots of players with differing sets of incentives. So if I want to go and order for Amazon for a delivery tomorrow, I'm a Prime member, I go and click on it gives me the option of do you want it on an Amazon day delivery, but why would I do that? I'm probably ordering it for tomorrow because I want it for tomorrow. I'm going to generate a drop. Amazon will then do its best to deliver that drop to me sometime during tomorrow because that's what it's committed to do. And I don't know if the guy next door to me wants a drop tomorrow and if it's going to come at the same time. Maybe the 3 Amazon deliveries will come to the street at the same time. There are lots of players with differing incentives, and everybody is maximizing their efficiency given the constraints they have and their customers' demand. So we have lots of interconnected players. We have an increasing demand for daily or on-demand deliveries. You know, you don't want to run out of paper in your photocopier and have to wait till next week to get some more. And there aren't incentives on players to avoid behavior that causes congestion on the street or in the roadside. There's a limited number of incentives that are done for that. Congestion charge is one, but it doesn't seem to be reducing congestion very much anymore. So move on, Sandy. So I want to give you an example of a supply chain. We talk about supply chains. This piece of work, could you go back one? I need to do the, yeah. So this, I went out with last year sometime. I went out with a supplier from the New Covent Garden market who's supplying to restaurants in the West End. I went out on a delivery trip and I mapped where they were dropping. So they were out between 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. dropping stuff in the West End in physically a fairly small area. You can see it's basically between Regent Street and Kingsway and the River and Mortimer Street. It's not a very big area. And if you now click the slide, you'll show the route we took by time. Now, if you were planning that trip, you probably wouldn't have done it that way. That's not terribly efficient in terms of where you go, but that's driven by a number of factors. Again, Sandy, the slide. So the timings are, the routing is driven by the time restrictions. Do you have keys? So can you get into the premises when the staff are not there? Or is there a secure location in which you can leave product even if you can't get in the premises? What does the customer say? You can only deliver when I'm there, or because I want to check the product, or no, it's okay, you can have a key and you can deliver anytime. What does their insurance company say? We'd love you to be able to deliver out of ours, but I'm afraid we can't give you a key because our insurer says no. And also road access. You have a bunch of deliveries there over on the left, 7, 04, 11 and 19. They're all in an area where you can't access by road until 7 a.m., which is why you try and get there at 7 a.m. because if you get there at 7:20, there's a whole queue of vehicles in front of you. It takes even longer. And then you've got the time taken to deliver each one. And that's driven by the curbside availability and the design of the building. So how far is the building from a legal loading zone? Might be double loading bay, might be a double yellow line with no blips, somewhere you can stop legally and safely to make your drop. How far is it? Where is the delivery in the building? Ground floor delivery, go straight in through the door with your key, or it's opened, drop the stuff in the kitchen and walk out again is quick. But maybe it's in a basement or the second floor. There's a lot more transit involved. I went with a supplier on a different trip to a building in Victoria Street, and it said it's a particular restaurant in there. He said if it had to deliver in there, it took him 20 minutes in the building to get there with the number of stairs, lifts, and so on. And do you have stair or lift access? If it's in the basement and you have stairs and you're trying to deliver 2 trolley loads of boxes, it can take you quite a long time to do that. Move on, Sandy. So the focus for we talk about in supply chain, if you want to do what Zega said we want to help Westminster reduce the number of deliveries and to make them more efficient, we've got to reduce, remode and retime. That's the 3 levers we talk about. So the first one is consolidation. And in this particular supply chain, we've looked at consolidation at source, so a single van for several suppliers. And we've also looked at making less frequent deliveries. Can you make deliveries every 2 or 3 days rather than daily? But on consolidation, the vans from New Covent Garden Market are full at departure, so you can't add more orders for the same area. And you can't use larger vehicles because you've got narrow streets, longer distances to move products, means you've have to move them products over longer distances. You can't park everywhere you can park with a small van. It's less efficient. And also, a regulatory factor is as soon as you move away from a light goods vehicle to medium one, your drivers have to have different licenses and you have operator requirements you have to meet. It's easier with a van, less than 3.5 tons. Most people who have had their licenses a reasonable time can drive them. Otherwise, you have to have more expensive people who've got specific licenses. And on frequent deliveries, well, fresh food you still need daily, but for other products, you could do less frequent deliveries, but most restaurants want to minimize the storage space they have at the premises because they want to make it usable space, generating income for them and for their landlord. So we have removed a lot of what used to be space you would store things in premises. We've also removed in the West End a lot of, for example, mews. I have one near me. The back of buildings used to be somewhere you would go and do your deliveries. They wouldn't be on the front, they'd be at the back. But all those have now been turned into useful revenue generating areas. But it does increase the complexity of the supply chain. Then remode is the next one. So we've talked to these guys in New Covent Garden Market. What about moving to cargo bike for some deliveries or move to EVs? Well, there was actually a piece of work done just before lockdown by CRP looking at could you use cargo bike for what are called second hit deliveries that the market has. That means when you run out at lunchtime of something because it's particularly possible, you ring up your supplier and say, can I have some more, please? And he'd send in a van with it on. Could you use cargo bikes for that? And the answer is yes. But that costs money, and the traders have got to the stage of saying, look, if we've forgotten to deliver you something or we've run out, I can let you have it, but it costs you a lot, or I'll give it to you free tomorrow. And that's what people tend to do. So their second hit's gone down a lot. And if you wanted to move the primary delivery to cargo bike, the main one, you can only do about 4 drops per bike trip. Unlike parcels, your drop size is quite big for fruit and veg. And you've got your return to base and return to drops is about 40 minutes from New Covent Garden to the West End. So it would take you, still to do the same number of 22 drops as I showed on the last plan, it would take you 50% longer time to do 1.5 hours instead, 3.5 hours, 4.5 hours instead of 3. And that costs money because that's people. somebody has to stay out longer. So it's not really efficient for this type of drop size. And moving to EV has a much higher capital cost, but you're doing a lower mileage. We talk a lot about, people talk about like EV and internal combustion engine fuel vehicles have a similar cost, but that depends on the mileage you do. And the average mileage for deliveries in the West End is quite low. And again, back to regulation and so on, there's currently a congestion charge discount for EVs, but that ends in December 25. And so that means that there's no longer the financial incentives that there currently is for people like the traders in Covent Garden to move. And on retiming, well, retiming would be moving even earlier, but one, they're already early enough to avoid the problems with traffic that you have. And also you'd have to change the whole rhythm of the market, because the timing of when they go out at 5 a.m. is driven by the rest of the market, where the rest of the market works. If you bring the whole of the market earlier, then it has an impact to the evening of the previous day. So it's a complicated thing to change. And if you move it earlier, you have to have even more keys and access arrangements. Move on. So I'm not trying to give you a tale of woe, but I say, well, let's think about one thing. What could we do, we, ZEG, what could ZEG members and their tenants do to support this element, the move to EV? Slide on, Sandy. Or click on. So some ideas. Encourage DLA to keep the congestion charge discount for EVans. That's something that a number of bodies are working on. And I know that some members of ZEG wrote to the mayor about this last year. For your tenants, well, maybe you could ask them to require zero emission deliveries, but they have to be willing to pay the extra cost, because it will cost more money. But supply chain people will do what the customer wants, particularly big supply chain operators. The customer is king. They will do what the customer wants, as long as they are still going to make money out of it. For landlords and bids, well, maybe you could find a way of allowing more deliveries to be made out of ours. Your security teams often hold keys for premises. There are other ways of allowing access. If you can do that, more deliveries can be made out of ours, and you say, but you can only do it if you have a zero emission vehicle. There's an incentive for the traders to invest. If it's more than 50%, they don't have to drive around the West End 3 times to make their deliveries. Maybe that's enough of an incentive to get them to switch. And Westminster could, for example, allow retiming of deliveries, like access to some of the spots you can't currently get access to early, if the vehicle is EV, because one of the reasons for restricting access times is noise, and electric vehicles are intrinsically much quieter than refrigerated internal combustion engine vehicles. It's just some ideas. I'm not saying any of them will work. We haven't tried a lot of them, but it's things to consider. But the point is, we have to work together. It's no good just saying to people like the suppliers in New Covent Garden Market, we want you to move to EV. You need to encourage them, unless you're just going to pay for it. Okay, move on, Sandy. Conscious of running out of time. Oh, don't know why that happened. So freight providers. So in my role at CLFQP, I talk to freight providers and their representatives, and this is their view of West End supply chains. So delivery practice come from what the customers want, and from the regulatory environment, things like that thing I talked about with the LGV, MGV requiring a different license. Freight is a low margin business, so they have to be efficient. So if you see deliveries that look inefficient, it's either the fault of customers or regulation. And I used to think about this. I used to think deliveries from New Covent Garden were inefficient, because every time I saw a vehicle in my area of Covent Garden, it was only a quarter full. I've realized actually it dropped the other 3/4 of its load before it got here. So they're not as inefficient as they look. Freight providers are always looking at ways to be more efficient, because they are in a low margin business and they need to be. And another thing is that freight providers believe people don't, when they make propose things they can do differently, they think about the last mile, what it costs at the last mile, the move from from van to cargo bike. But it's not just the last mile that's important, it's the total cost from origin of the product. That's what matters. They also make the point that their freight efficiency is reducing. They say 20% reduction in 5 years in central London, because of the removal of curbside loading areas for other uses, introduction of bike lanes, doctors' bike parking, EV charging, That means they have to move further along the curb, which increases the time at curb, and deliveries take longer. You can imagine it's a snowball effect. There are few places to stop. The next vehicle that comes can't find the one that's even closest to where he wants to deliver. He's got to go to one even further away. So it magnifies. And then the introduction of LTNs across the city, across London, means it does take longer to get around. And also journeys have become less predictable. And that means if you have a booked delivery slot, you have to plan the risk of a longer delay in getting there. So you have to allow more time, and you haven't got anywhere you can stop. And then, and the other thing, freight providers, and these are the ones who run the vans and trucks, say, cargo bikes don't work for everything. They're good for low drop size, high drop density, which is why you see them a lot for parcels, and for point-to-point deliveries as long as they're not too big. But that's not a lot of what comes into the West End. It's a lot of what we see in our homes, in our offices, all those parcels that we order from Amazon. But there's a reason why your Ocado or Tesco delivery doesn't arrive on a cargo bike. It arrives in a van that's doing 20 other deliveries, because that's more efficient for the provider. And the other point they make is zero emission currently costs more money, and there need to be incentives to encourage people to switch, either because they're a big enough company that they're going to do it for PR reasons, but also, as Sandy mentioned, a lot of vans are owner driven. They're not going to switch just because it's a PR exercise. They'll switch because their customer demands it. And when you start to think about zero emission, it's not broadly available for bigger vehicles. Car-derived vans, the smaller ones, of which you see a lot on the street, now electric, it works. But for the bigger vans, there aren't that many options, partly because the UK is different, it's a right-hand drive. Most of the continent's left-hand drive. People don't want to make vehicles for two markets unless they know there's a big demand. We're not there yet. Okay, Sandy, I think that was it from me.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. That's fantastic, and that kind of concludes really the workshop.